Hey kids, hope everybody's doing well at home. Um, I know this has been a really tough time, but I know that we're going to one of these days. I hopefully very soon have a chance to get back together in the classroom. Um, Today, what we're going to do is we're going to continue on with the instruction that we've already started. So we've just wrapped up the China unit. We're going to move on to the Southeast Asia unit now. Along with this video and this presentation, which I will be posting. I'll also post a series of video or of presentation questions. And what that'll do is it'll kind of take you through this presentation and have you answer some questions about some of the content just to make sure that you're kind of getting everything that you need to have. If at any point you can't find the questions in the video or in the presentation, feel free to look at other outside resources. But the sheets that I'm going to be posting are pretty much summarizing the most important information that you're going to have aside from any other assignments that I'm posting in addition to these presentations. So we're going to start with Southeast Asia, and this is the region just south of China, and this region is going to be influenced by a lot of different places, and it's going to have a lot of diversity. It's geographically located in an ideal spot for trade and control of trade, but it's also going to suffer a little bit from outside influences as Europeans come to this region and realize that this is a place that not only has a lot of awesome products, particularly things like coffee and tea, but it's also going to be a region that will benefit the Europeans by controlling a lot of the trade that happens through this region. So we're going to start with the geography and work a little bit of the way through. I think what I'm going to do is try to break this down into 2 or 3 different videos, probably 3. So this first one's going to focus on geography in the early kingdoms. So if you take a look at this map here, we have this just helps to identify what we're talking about as far as the geographic location when we talk about Southeast Asia. So we've already done India, located right here, and we've already done China, located right here. And as you can see, Southeast Asia is essentially located right directly between the two. And what this is going to mean for this region is it's going to have a lot of influence from India and China, but it's also going to be an area that when trade begins between European colonists, they're going to find the shortest way to get from India to China or Japan is going to be to go through Southeast Asia. And so these nations are really going to benefit from some of that trade that's going to take place. These are some of the major issues that are going to come up, and I'm not going to read through each one of these. You can pause the video at any point and really kind of read through it. But in a nutshell, essentially what's going to happen is we're going to see, first and foremost, the early groups that are going to develop in this region are going to be kind of spread out. They're going to be clustered around. The geography of the region, as we'll see in a second, really is split up between islands and a mainland section. But even on those islands and those mainland sections, we're going to have a lot of geographic separation due to dense jungles, mountain ranges, and just the nature of the islands or archipelagos in this region that are going to separate people out quite a bit. Also, what we're going to see is that the result of this separation is going to be a lot of cultural diversity, a lot of religious diversity, a lot of linguistic diversity. And so this is a region that's never really been unified or cohesive in any way, which also helps to explain why we have so many different nations throughout this very kind of small region. These are people who are diverse and separated out throughout history, and that influences where they are today. So we do have 2 main regions. The first region of Southeast Asia is going to be the mainland region. This is the area on what we oftentimes refer to as the Indochina Peninsula. This peninsula is kind of an extension off of the southern section of China, and this includes the countries of Myanmar, Thailand, and then a region we refer to as Indochina, which includes the countries of Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. The second region we refer to as the insular region or the archipelago region. These are all the islands throughout much of this region. Nations like Malaysia, which is actually kind of half on the mainland, half on the insular section, Indonesia, which is made up and composed of thousands of islands. Singapore, which is a tiny little city-state nation right at the tip of the Malay Peninsula. The Philippines, which is an archipelago all of its own, and the tiny kingdom of Brunei, which lies within Indonesia. This map will give us a pretty good idea of how things are separated out. So the blue and red lines represent up here on the mainland section represent mountain ranges, the red lines, and river valleys. So you can see the ways in which these mountain ranges kind of extend down into this peninsula like fingers, and the river valleys exist in between. So we're going to see, as we've seen throughout history, a lot of the civilizations will organize themselves here around the river valleys, but they will be separated by these thick vegetation throughout this area, and also these mountain ranges. So we get a lot of diversity here. And then if we look at the archipelagos, you can see that throughout the archipelagos, we have the Philippines up here. This is Indonesia. Brunei is located right in here. This is Singapore, located right in this region. And so throughout this whole region, you're going to have a lot of diversity and a lot of separation. So I did mention before a region called Indochina. This is called Indochina primarily because of its geographic location between India and China. The nations of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos are all part of what's referred to as Indochina, and they're all former French colonies. And this will be important later on when we talk a little bit about when these nations tried to gain their independence from France, primarily following World War II. But it's also going to have not just a French flavor to it, but it's also going to have a little bit of an or an Indian influence in this region, and a Chinese influence in this region. So this is a region that's got a lot of diversity, not just from the groups that are native to the region, but also from outside groups and the ways in which they've been influenced. One of the other major factors here is going to be the water influences on this region, the navigational influences on the region, and the biggest geographic feature as far as that goes here is the Strait of Malacca. So you can see this red line that's located here. This is the Strait of Malacca. This separates out Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore. Now, throughout history, the Strait of Malacca has had a huge influence on a couple of things. First of all, allowing traders to navigate between India and China. This is the shortest route. If they're going from west to east or east to west, the fastest way for them to get from point A to point B is to go through the Strait of Malacca. To go around a lot of these, the archipelagos, meant time and money. So what they would do is they would go through the Strait of Malacca in their attempt to get to shorten their travels and to maximize the number of trips that they can make. The other thing that this did is in the region, it has developed historically a lot of wealth for whoever could control the Strait of Malacca. And so today we have the city-state of Singapore, which is one of the wealthiest nations on earth. And its wealth is derived from its ability to control trade, but also to be in a geographically advantageous area. But even in the past, whoever could control this area could control trade through this region, had a means for basically charging a toll. And what they could do is not only benefit from being a part of the trade that was taking place, but also by controlling the trade that took place through this region. So this is an early crossroads. We are going to see a lot of influence, but there's going to be three primary groups that are going to have an influence in this region. And this is going to be the Chinese, the Indians, and the Arabs. So first, let's talk a little bit about the Chinese. The Chinese are going to have an influence. When we covered China, we talked a little bit about this, how different dynasties, the map here shows essentially the Tang dynasty having the influence, but they're not the only ones that are going to extend into this area. But what they're going to do is they're going to establish what are called tributary states. And a tributary state is essentially a state that is allowed, or a nation that is allowed to have and maintain its independence. But that independence is controlled by a separate state. And the way in which you maintain that control is by forcing a country to pay you, essentially. So The tributary state in this case is going to be primarily Vietnam. We'll also see, so Vietnam is located right in this yellowish region. Myanmar, which is going to be located a little bit further to the left over here or to the west. But what the Chinese are going to do is they're basically going to say, hey, we'll leave you alone as long as you pay us. You give us what we want, you give us trade products, you give us whatever we demand, and we're not going to invade, we're not going to send in troops. We're essentially going to let you be independent, and we'll leave you alone as much as we can, but it's going to come at a cost to you. So with the Chinese coming into this region, we're also going to see an influence in a lot of different ways. And so you can see the main contributions here are going to be, first two are religious, Confucianism. What they're going to do is the Vietnamese are going to adopt a lot of the Confucian practices of the Chinese as far as the social order. Then they're also going to be influenced by the Chinese or East Asian version of Buddhism, which is called, again, Mahayana Buddhism. We talked about this early on, and this is like the Buddhism for everyday people. But also through written language in particular, the Vietnamese will adopt a lot of the Chinese written characters, also through art and architecture. From the west, we're going to see the Indian influence. And so Indians are going to arrive by sea around the 1st century. Their primary influences are going to be throughout the western parts of Southeast Asia. During the Srivijaya Empire, we're going to see them start to adopt a lot of the Cambodian influence. The Indian influence in this region is going to include things like Hinduism, Theravada Buddhism. And if you remember, Theravada Buddhism was that monastic style of Buddhism where people devote their lives to being a Buddhist monk. But also throughout this region, we're going to see some Indian influences as far as architecture as well. And so we'll start to see places like Angkor Wat, which is a Hindu complex located up here in what is modern-day Cambodia. This is one of the world's majestic architectural sites, and it still exists today. But the Indian influence on this region is going to be primarily to the western, as we would imagine, to the western sections of Southeast Asia. And then lastly, we have the Arab influence. So the Arabs are going to come by trade, and you can see on the map, you can see the trade routes that are going to connect the Arabs to the whole region from West Africa all the way over into parts of East Asia. But again, all of this is going to go through Southeast Asia. The biggest influence the Arabs are going to have on this area are going to be religious. So to this day, or today, Indonesia is the largest, most populous Muslim country in the world. It's not Arabia. It's not anywhere in the Middle East. It's in Indonesia. And the influence of the Arab traders in this region is going to influence much of Southeast Asia up until this day. So let's move on really quick. Want to talk a little bit about the First Global Age, and this is where we start to have European influence. So we're going to have a couple of phases of European influence in this region. The first are going to be the Portuguese, followed by the Dutch, and eventually the Spanish. The Portuguese and the Dutch are going to be the earliest influences throughout much of Asia. And the key thing here between these two is the Portuguese are Catholic and the Dutch are Protestant. And that has a huge influence in the ways in which they approach trade, control, and whatever is going to happen in this region. Now, we've already talked a little bit about China. And in China, the Portuguese are going to try to push in with Catholic influence, and they're going to try to bring in missionaries. The Dutch, on the other hand, as Protestants, they're not so much interested in missionary work. They're more interested in just establishing trade. And we're going to see this in Japan as well, where Dutch are going to be given preferential treatment over the Portuguese because they're not interested in cultural change. They're just simply interested in trade. So you can see on this map the early colonial territories throughout the region, and then some later ones that are going to come in. But you can see The Dutch are the green section here. They're going to have control over much of the what is today Indonesia, the Spanish in the Philippines, eventually France in what is Indochina, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. And then this red section is the British. So the British are going to come in a little bit later on, and they'll have their own influence throughout the region. When we look at colonization of this region, again, there's huge diversity between how the Catholic countries and the Protestant countries are going to try to have an influence in this region. Like all colonization, this is really pushed primarily by access to materials and new markets, but it is going to come with that side effect of Christian conversion through missionaries. Different nations are going to react differently to these things. Some are going to welcome it, like the Philippines. There really isn't much of a conflict over missionary work and the influence of the Catholic Church in that region. Others are going to push back against it. But by the 1890s here, we're going to see control throughout much of the region by European countries. Again, they're primarily interested in raw materials and new markets, places where they can sell their own products. But they're also going to bring with them a lot of technological influence, a lot of cultural influence. So on top of those early layers of Indian, Chinese, and Arab influence, we now have to add on top of this another layer of European influence. And so in a place like Vietnam, we get the early Chinese influence. We have the native cultural practices that already exist in that region. And now we're going to add on top of that, primarily by the 1890s, another French influence and a Catholic influence. And so you can see how throughout Southeast Asia, if we just look at Vietnam, which is where we're going to go next, you can see how all of these things are kind of culturally being layered one on top of another. And that's going to have a huge impact on the ways in which these regions are going to develop, but also in the ways in which their independence movements are going to play out. So the major effects of colonialism in this region are similar to what we've seen everywhere else. We're going to have a lot of European goods coming into the area. As colonies are developed, different countries from Europe are going to bring in different products that are going to have an impact on people here. A lot of modernization will take place as the Europeans introduce things like railroads and telegraph systems and things like that. In a place like Vietnam and the Philippines, Catholicism is going to have a huge impact, particularly the Philippines, one of the largest Catholic countries in the world. But then also cultural diversity, the ways in which this is going to impact a lot of different regions, and education. If we talk about Vietnam again, they're going to bring not only certain religious institutions and cultural practices, but they'll also bring along educational influence. And many of the natives will be educated themselves in European countries, but particularly in places like Paris. So this gives us a little bit of a timeline here for you to look at. The major products that we're looking at throughout this colonization is going to be sugar, coffee, tea, cotton, rice, woods. Even to this day, hardwood is a major demand from this region. Rubber in the form of rubber trees, tin as a metal, and oil. If you can look right through this this timeline kind of on your own, but you can see the different European influences and the regions in which they had control. And then at the bottom here, you can see by 1898, we're going to start to have some American influence in this region as the Americans go to Japan. They're then going to extend further down into Southeast Asia. And in the Philippines in particular, we're going to maintain that as a protectorate, as a territory of the United States. All right, so I'm going to end this video right here. The next one will pick up here with 1945, and we'll talk a little bit about World War II, the influence on the region, and the ways in which that led to independence.